The slap echoed across the restaurant before anyone could pretend not to hear it. Omotola stood frozen, her cheek burning a half-wrapped plate of food trembling in her hands. The rich guests stared, some amused, some indifferent, as the old man beside her, barefoot and trembling, lowered his eyes in silence. She fed a beggar with customers' food, the manager spat, but the old man didn't look ashamed. He looked calm. And as Omotola fought back tears, he slowly lifted his head, his gaze steady, almost powerful, as if this moment, this humiliation, was not the end of her story, but the beginning of something no one in that room was ready for. Where are you watching from today, and what time is it there? If stories like this move, you don't forget to subscribe and be part of our journey. In the restless heart of Lagos, where the streets never truly slept, and the air carried the weight of both dreams and disappointments, Omotola woke up before dawn. Her alarm was not a clock. It was the quiet, uneven breathing of her younger brother. "Tunde," she whispered softly, sitting up on the thin mattress they shared. The room was barely large enough for two people to stretch their legs, its peeling walls stained by years of damp heat. A small window let in the faint gray of early morning, and through it came the distant noise of buses shouting vendors, and life already beginning without them. Tunde lay curled beside her, his chest rising and falling too quickly, as if each breath had to fight to stay. His skin glistened with sweat, even in the cool hour before sunrise. Omotola pressed her hand gently to his forehead, still hot. Her stomach tightened. She had hoped the fever would break overnight. It hadn't. "I'm okay," Tunde murmured, weakly, sensing her touch. His eyes opened halfway, forcing a small smile that did not reach his tired face. "You should go to work. Madame Bose will be angry again." Omotola swallowed. Even in sickness, he worried about her job. "I'll bring you medicine today," she said, her voice steady, though her heart wasn't. Proper medicine, not just herbs. Tunde nodded, trusting her completely. That trust was heavier than anything she carried. Omotola turned away for a moment, reaching for the small metal box hidden under their bed. She opened it slowly, as if hoping something inside would magically multiply overnight. It didn't. A few crumpled naira notes, some coins. Not enough. Not even close. She closed the box gently, her fingers lingering on its surface. There was rent due in 3 days. There was food to buy, and now medicine. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel it, the quiet panic pressing against her chest. But only for a moment. Then she stood up. Because she didn't have the luxury of falling apart. By the time the sun fully rose, Omotola was already walking through the busy streets toward the restaurant where she worked. Her uniform, orange and white, had faded from too many washes. The seams were worn, the fabric thinning at the elbows. She had stitched it herself more times than she could count. Still, she wore it with dignity, because it was the only thing standing between her and nothing. The restaurant Golden Plate Lounge stood in sharp contrast to everything around it. Its glass doors gleamed. Its floors shined. Inside, laughter came easily, especially from those who had never worried about the price of a meal. Omotola paused briefly outside, taking a quiet breath. Then she stepped in. Late again. The voice came before she even reached the staff area. Madame Bose. She stood near the counter, arms folded tightly across her chest, her sharp eyes already scanning Omotola from head to toe, as if looking for another reason to complain. "It's 5 minutes to 6, Mom," Omotola said respectfully, lowering her gaze. 5 minutes is still late when I say 6. Means 6. Madame Bose snapped. "Or do you think this is your father's house?" "No, Ma." Omotola bowed her head slightly. Apologies were part of her daily routine, even when she had done nothing wrong. "Go change. And don't let me catch you slowing down today. We have important guests coming." "Yes, Ma." Omotola moved quickly, slipping into the small changing corner and tying her apron with practiced hands. Her body already felt tired, but her day had barely begun. The morning rush came like a storm. Orders shouted, plates clattering, customers demanding. Omotola moved from table to table, balancing trays, forcing gentle smiles, apologizing even when the mistakes weren't hers. "Hey, girl," a man snapped his fingers at her without looking up. She walked over immediately. "Yes, sir? This soup is cold. I'm sorry, sir. I'll replace it right away." "And be quick," he added, waving her away as if she were invisible. Omotola nodded and rushed back to the kitchen. Behind her, laughter erupted at another table. She didn't turn. She had learned not to. "Careful, Omotola." The voice was softer this time. Kemi, one of the other waitresses. Her smile looked friendly, but her eyes always held something else, something sharp. "You don't want Madame Bose to shout again," Kemi added, adjusting her own neat uniform. "I know," Omotola replied quietly. Kemi leaned closer. "You know?" she said in a low voice. "Some people say you're only still here because you beg too well." Omotola froze for a fraction of a second. Then she kept moving. She didn't respond, because responding would only make it worse. Kemi chuckled softly behind her. Hours passed. The restaurant grew busier, then quieter, then busy again. Omotola hadn't eaten. She hadn't rested, but she kept going, because every tray she carried meant a few more naira, and every naira meant a step closer to medicine for Tunde. By midday, her hands were trembling slightly from exhaustion. She stepped into the back for a moment, reaching into her small bag. Inside was her lunch, a simple portion of rice, plain, no meat, no sauce. It was all she could afford. She stared at it for a moment. Her stomach tightened. She hadn't eaten since the night before. But then she thought of Tunde, and she closed the container again. "I'll eat later," she whispered to herself. Later had become her way of surviving. Omotola Madame Bose's voice cut through the room again. "Yes, Ma, table 7. VIP. Don't embarrass this restaurant." "Yes, Ma." Omotola wiped her hands quickly and picked up a tray. As she walked toward the front, she straightened her posture, forcing her tired body to move with grace. Because in this place, dignity was something you had to fight to keep. And she was still fighting. even if no one noticed. Outside, just beyond the glass doors of the restaurant, life continued in its raw, unfiltered form. Vendors shouted. Children ran barefoot. And somewhere near the entrance, sitting quietly against the wall, was an old man no one had paid attention to. Yet. Omotola hadn't seen him yet, but fate had already placed him in her path. And before the day would end, her life would begin to change in ways she could never have imagined. The afternoon sun hung heavily over Lagos, casting sharp shadows across the polished glass of Golden Plate Lounge. Inside, the air was cool, controlled, almost detached from the harshness outside. But just beyond the entrance, real life waited. Omotola pushed through the back door with a tray of empty plates, her steps slower now, her body finally beginning to feel the weight of the long day. Sweat clung to her neck, and her stomach twisted painfully, reminding her she still hadn't eaten. She stepped outside for a moment, hoping for just a breath of fresh air. That was when she saw him. An old man, sitting on the ground near the wall. At first he looked like any other forgotten soul the city had swallowed thin-tired, wrapped in clothes that had long lost their original color. His feet were bare, dust-covered, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if the years had pressed him downward. People walked past him. No one stopped. No one looked. It was as if he didn't exist. Omotola stood still. Something in her chest shifted. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the way his hands rested loosely in his lap, empty, yet not begging. Maybe it was the quiet dignity in the way he sat, not pleading, not chasing anyone for help. Or maybe it was simply because she understood hunger. She walked closer slowly. She said gently. The old man lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment the world around them seemed to fade. There was no desperation in his gaze, no shame, just calm. "Yes, my daughter," he replied softly. His voice was steady, grounded, not broken like his appearance suggested. Omotola hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her tray. Have you eaten today?" she asked. The old man smiled faintly. "A man learns to be patient when life gives him little," he said. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. Omotola swallowed. Her stomach tightened again. She thought of the small container in her bag. Her only meal. The only thing she had been holding on to all day. The thing she told herself she needed to keep going. Her mind whispered, "You need this. You haven't eaten. You have Tunde to take care of. You can't afford to give things away." But her heart said something else. She looked at the old man again, really looked this time, and she saw it. The same quiet exhaustion she saw in the mirror every morning. The same silent endurance. The same loneliness. Without another word, Omotola turned and hurried back inside. "Where have you been?" Kemi's voice snapped as Omotola passed. Just outside, Omotola replied quickly. "Don't let Madame Bose see you wandering. She's already in a bad mood." Omotola nodded, but didn't stop. She went straight to the staff corner, reached into her bag, and pulled out the container. She held it for a moment. Her hands trembled slightly. This was all she had. Then she opened it. The faint smell of plain rice rose into the air. Simple, but precious. She closed her eyes briefly, then took a breath, and walked back outside. The old man hadn't moved. He was still sitting in the same place, as if time did not touch him. Omotola approached and knelt down beside him. "Please," she said softly, holding out the container. "You can have this." The old man looked at the food, then at her. "You have eaten?" he asked. Omotola forced a small smile. "I will eat later." A familiar lie. But this time it felt heavier. The old man studied her face. Not quickly, not carelessly, but deeply, as if he was seeing something beyond what she showed. "You are giving me your own meal," he said quietly. Omotola shook her head. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. And somehow, he knew. Slowly, he reached out and accepted the container. "May your kindness return to you in ways you cannot yet imagine," he said. Omotola lowered her eyes, slightly embarrassed. She wasn't used to being thanked like that. She stood up quickly. "I should go back inside," she murmured. But before she could leave, the old man spoke again. "What is your name?" She paused. "Omotola." He nodded slowly. "Omotola," he repeated as if committing it to memory. "I am called Baba Adwaling." She gave a small nod, then turned and hurried back inside before anyone noticed she was gone too long. Unfortunately, someone had already noticed. Omotola Madame Bose's voice cut through the restaurant like a blade. Every head turned. Omotola froze. Slowly she walked toward her manager. "Yes, Ma." "What were you doing outside?" Madame Bose demanded, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "I was just what she interrupted. Neglecting your duties or entertaining your street friends." A few customers glanced over, curious. Kemi stood nearby, watching, waiting. "I went out for a moment, Ma," Omotola said quietly. Madame Bose stepped closer. "And what did you take with you?" Omotola's heart dropped. Nothing, Ma." "Don't lie to me," Madame Bose snapped. "I saw you go to your bag." The room seemed to tighten around her. Omotola hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough. Madame Bose's eyes narrowed. "You gave food away, didn't you?" she said coldly. Silence. Omotola didn't answer. She didn't need to. The truth was already written on her face. A murmur spread among the nearby staff. "She fed a beggar," Kemi whispered, just loud enough for others to hear. Madame Bose's expression hardened. "Do you think this is a charity?" she said sharply. "Customers pay for food here, not for you to give it away to dirty people outside." Omotola felt heat rise to her face. "I'm sorry, Ma," she said softly. "Sorry?" Madame Bose scoffed. "Sorry does not replace stolen food. I didn't steal." Silence. Madame Bose snapped, her voice rising. Now customers were openly watching. Some amused, some indifferent, some judging. Madame Bose leaned in slightly. If I ever see you do something like that again, she said in a low, threatening tone, you will lose this job. Do you understand? Omotola nodded quickly. Yes, Ma. Go back to work. She turned and walked away. Her hands were shaking. Her chest felt tight. But she didn't cry. Not here. Not where they could see. She picked up a tray, walked it to the next table. Good afternoon, sir, she said, her voice steady despite everything. Inside, something hurt. But something else remained unbroken. Outside, Baba Adewale sat quietly eating the rice slowly, carefully, as if it mattered, if it was more than just food. His eyes lifted briefly toward the glass doors, toward the girl who had just been humiliated because of him. A faint, almost invisible smile touched his lips, not of amusement, but of certainty. Because what no one inside that restaurant understood was that a seed had just been planted, and soon it would grow into something that would shake every single one of them. The days that followed did not get easier. If anything, they became heavier, slower, more suffocating, like the air before a storm that refused to break. Omotola still arrived before sunrise. She still moved through Golden Plate Lounge with quiet precision, balancing trays, lowering her eyes, speaking softly, even when others raised their voices at her. But something had changed. Not in her, in how they saw her. Be careful, Kemi muttered one morning as Omotola passed by with a tray of drinks. You might give those away, too. A few of the staff chuckled under their breath. Omotola didn't respond. She kept walking. But the words followed her, everywhere. She feeds beggars now. Maybe she is one. Who knows what else she takes? The whispers were never loud enough to be called out. But they were never quiet enough to ignore. Madame Bose had not forgotten either. Table 4, move faster, she barked. Omotola quickened her pace. And don't even think of stepping outside today, Madame Bose added sharply. This is a restaurant, not a feeding center for street people. Yes, Ma, the words came automatically, even as her chest tightened, because she knew what that meant. It meant she wouldn't see him. Baba Adewale. The thought lingered in her mind longer than she expected. Not because she owed him anything, not because she expected anything in return, but because something about him had felt different. He hadn't looked at her the way others did. He hadn't looked through her or above her. He had looked at her as if she mattered, and in a place where she was constantly made to feel invisible. That stayed with her. By midday, the restaurant was filled again. Laughter, clinking glasses, voices that carried confidence and comfort. Omotola moved quietly among them, her body aching, her stomach empty once again. She hadn't brought lunch today. There had been nothing left. Omotola, she turned quickly. Yes, Ma. Madame Bose pointed toward a table near the window. Those customers have been waiting. Don't embarrass me. Yes, Ma. Omotola walked toward the table. Two women sat there dressed in expensive fabrics, their wrists adorned with gold that caught the light with every movement. They didn't look at her when she approached. Good afternoon, Ma, Omotola said politely. What would you like to order? One of them sighed loudly, finally. The other glanced up briefly, her eyes scanning Omotola from head to toe. You people are always slow, she said dismissively. I'm sorry, Ma, Omotola replied. Of course you are, the woman muttered. Just take the order. Omotola wrote quietly, as they spoke, her pen moving steadily, even as their tone grew sharper, more impatient. And make sure it's hot this time, one added. Not like yesterday. I will, Ma. And clean the table properly. It smells. Omotola nodded again. Yes, Ma. She walked away without looking back. Her face remained calm. But inside, there was a quiet weight pressing down. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just exhaustion. Later that afternoon, as the crowd began to thin, Omotola found herself near the entrance again. Not outside, just inside, close enough to see through the glass. And there he was, Baba Adewale, sitting in the same place, as if he had never left. Her heart lifted slightly. Without realizing it, she took a small step closer to the door. Then another. Omotola. She froze. Madame Bose's voice. Sharp. Close. You seem very interested in what is happening outside, she said coldly. Omotola turned quickly. No, Ma. I was just doing what I told you not to do. Madame Bose cut in. No, Ma. Madame Bose followed her gaze and saw him, the old man. Her lips tightened. That man again, she said with clear disgust. He has been sitting there for days now. Filthy. Omotola said nothing. You will not go near him. Madame Bose continued. Do you understand, yes, Ma? If I see you talking to him again, I will assume you have no respect for this establishment. Omotola lowered her eyes. I understand, Ma. Good. Madame Bose walked away. Omotola stood still for a moment, then slowly returned to her duties. But something inside her resisted. Not loudly, not rebelliously, just quietly. As evening approached, the sky outside softened into a dull orange glow. The street grew busier again. Vendors returned. Voices rose. Life continued. Inside, Omotola cleared the last few tables. Her body felt like it was made of stone. Heavy, slow. But she kept moving, because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant feeling. And feeling was dangerous. Omotola, a voice called softly. She turned. It was Sade, one of the newer waitresses. Unlike Kemi Sade's expression carried hesitation, rather than mockery. You haven't eaten all day, have you? Sade asked quietly. Omotola forced a small smile. I'm fine. Sade frowned slightly. You always say that. Omotola shrugged gently. It's true, but it wasn't. And they both knew it. Sade hesitated, then reached into her own bag and pulled out a small piece of bread. Take this, she said. Omotola shook her head immediately. No, you need it. I ate earlier, Sade insisted. Please. Omotola looked at the bread, then at Sade for a moment. She was tempted, but then she thought of Tunde, and how every small thing mattered. You should keep it, she said softly. Thank you. Sade didn't argue again, but her eyes lingered. Night fell slowly. One by one, the lights inside the restaurant dimmed. Customers left. Chairs were stacked. Floors were cleaned. Omotola stepped outside at last. The air felt different now, cooler, quieter, and there he was, still sitting there. Baba Adewale. She walked toward him, her steps slow but certain. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I couldn't come earlier." The old man looked up and smiled. "There is no need to apologize for kindness delayed," he said. Omotola sat down beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city moved around them, but they remained still. "Have you eaten today?" she asked again. The old man chuckled lightly. "A little." Omotola nodded. She didn't have anything to give this time, and it showed in her eyes. "I had nothing today," she admitted quietly. The old man studied her face, then nodded slowly. "You gave when you had," he said. "That is what matters." Omotola looked down at her hands. "They almost fired me because of it." "But they didn't," he replied. She exhaled softly. "No, not yet." Silence settled again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was peaceful. "You are tired," Baba Adewale said. After a while, Omotola smiled faintly. "I've been tired for a long time." The old man's eyes softened. "Yet you still give." Omotola shrugged gently. "If I stop, I don't know what I'll become." Baba Adewale nodded, as if he understood more than she had said. A breeze passed between them, carrying dust, carrying noise, carrying the weight of a city that never paused for anyone. "You should go home," he said finally. "Your brother is waiting." Omotola looked at him surprised. "How did you—" "A sister carries worry in her eyes," he said simply. She smiled slightly, then stood up. "Good night, Baba Adewale. Good night, Omotola." She walked away slowly, her steps still heavy, her future still uncertain, but her heart a little lighter. Behind her, Baba Adewale watched her disappear into the night. The calm in his eyes remained. But now, there was something else. A quiet decision. Because while the world saw a poor girl barely surviving, he was beginning to see something far more valuable, something rare, something powerful. And he knew this story was far from over. That night, Omotola returned to the small room she called home with slower steps than usual. The streets of Lagos were still alive, vendors shouting music spilling from passing buses, laughter echoing from roadside gatherings. But to her, everything felt distant. Her mind was elsewhere. On Tunde, on the empty metal box under their bed, on the quiet words of Baba Adewale. She pushed the wooden door open gently. "Tunde," she called softly. "I'm here." His weak voice answered from inside. Omotola stepped in quickly. The room felt warmer than it should. Stuffy, heavy. Tunde lay curled under the thin sheet, his breathing shallow again. A small bowl of water sat beside him, untouched. Omotola dropped her bag and rushed to his side. "You didn't drink this?" she asked, touching the bowl. "I wasn't thirsty," he murmured, though his cracked lips said otherwise. Omotola dipped a cloth into the water and gently placed it on his forehead. "You have to keep your strength," she whispered. Tunde looked at her, his eyes searching her face. "Did you eat today?" he asked. Omotola hesitated, then smiled. "Yes." Another lie. Tunde nodded slowly, satisfied. He trusted her too easily, and that trust hurt more than any hunger. Later that night, when Tunde finally fell asleep, Omotola reached for the metal box again. She opened it under the dim glow of a flickering bulb. Coins, a few notes, still not enough. Not for hospital bills, not for proper medicine, not even for rent in 3 days. She stared at the money for a long time. Her mind began to race. Maybe she could borrow. But from who everyone she knew was struggling. Maybe she could ask Madame Bose for an advance. But the thought alone made her chest tighten. Madame Bose didn't give. She took. Maybe she could skip rent and use the money for Tunde. But then they would be thrown out. The options circled her mind like shadows. None of them good. None of them enough. Omotola closed the box slowly and rested her head against the wall. For the first time in a long while, she felt afraid, not for herself, but for him. Morning came too quickly. Tunde's fever had not broken. If anything, it had worsened. Omotola pressed her hand to his forehead and felt the heat burning stronger. "We're going to the hospital today," she said firmly. Tunde shook his head weakly. "We don't have money. I will find it." Her voice carried more confidence than she felt, but she needed him to believe it. At the restaurant, the pressure felt even heavier than usual. Omotola moved faster, worked harder, tried to ignore the dizziness creeping in from hunger and lack of sleep. Because today, she needed money. Not later, not someday, today. Omotola Madame Bose's voice cut through the noise again. "Yes, Ma." "Why are you moving like a tired goat?" Madame Bose snapped. "Customers are waiting." "I'm sorry, Ma." "Sorry. Will not pay bills," Madame Bose retorted. "Focus." Omotola nodded quickly and rushed off. Her vision blurred slightly for a moment, but she kept going. Hours passed. No tips, no extra money, nothing. Every tray she carried felt heavier, every step slower. During a brief moment in the back, she leaned against the wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands were shaking. Her body was reaching its limit. But she couldn't stop. Not today. Still pretending to be strong? Kemi's voice came from behind her. Omotola didn't turn. "I'm working," she said quietly. Kemi laughed softly. "You always are, but working doesn't fix everything." Omotola remained silent. Kemi stepped closer. "I heard your brother is sick." she said, her tone now carrying something sharper. Omotola's body tensed. Who told you that? She asked. Kemi shrugged. People talk. Omotola turned slightly, her eyes meeting Kemi's. What do you want? She asked. Kemi smiled. Nothing. Just be careful. Desperate people do desperate things. Omotola's chest tightened. I'm not a thief, she said quietly. Kemi's smile widened. I didn't say you were, but her eyes said everything. That afternoon, Omotola made a decision. A difficult one, but the only one she had. She approached Madame Bose. Ma, may I speak with you? She asked respectfully. Madame Bose barely looked up. What is it? I wanted to ask if I could receive part of my salary. Early, Omotola said carefully. Madame Bose paused, then slowly raised her head. Advance, she repeated. Yes, Ma. My brother is sick. I need to take him to the hospital. Madame Bose stared at her for a long moment, then laughed, a short, cold laugh. Do I look like a charity to you? She said. Omotola's heart sank. No, Ma. I just thought... You thought wrong, Madame Bose cut in sharply. If I start giving advances to every sob story, this place will close in a week. Omotola swallowed. I understand, Ma. Good. Now go back to work. Omotola stepped away slowly. Her last hope gone. That evening, as the sun dipped low again, Omotola stood near the entrance. Her body drained, her mind heavy. She looked outside and saw him. Baba Adewale, still there, still watching the world pass him by. This time, she didn't hesitate. She walked out and sat beside him. For a moment, she said nothing, because she didn't know where to begin. You are carrying more than yesterday, Baba Adewale said gently. Omotola let out a soft, tired breath. My brother is very sick, she said. The words came out slowly. He listened, without interruption, without judgment. I need money for the hospital, she continued, but I don't have enough. I tried everything today. Her voice broke slightly, just slightly, but it was enough. Baba Adewale looked at her quietly. And yet, you are still here, he said. Omotola frowned slightly. I don't understand. You could have taken what is not yours, he said. You could have chosen another path. Omotola shook her head immediately. No, even in exhaustion, even in fear. That answer was certain. I can't do that, she said. Even if it saves him, he asked. The question hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. Omotola looked down at her hands. Then slowly, she shook her head again. I don't want to save him by becoming someone he wouldn't recognize, she said softly. Silence followed. Deep, meaningful. Baba Adewale nodded slowly, as if something had just been confirmed. Omotola reached into her pocket, pulled out a small coin, the last one she had. She looked at it for a moment, then placed it gently beside him. It's not much, she said, but maybe it can help you tonight. Voila. Baba Adewale looked at the coin, then at her. You have nothing left, he said. Omotola gave a small, tired smile. Then We are the same. For a brief moment, the world felt still again. But what Omotola did not know was that this moment, this choice, this quiet act of giving, when she had nothing left, was the one that would change everything. The next morning began with a quiet heaviness that Omotola could not explain, but could feel in every part of her body. It was not just the exhaustion from days of hunger and sleepless nights, nor was it only the worry that clung to her thoughts like a shadow. It was something deeper, something that made even the simplest movement feel like a burden she could barely carry. Tunde had barely rested through the night. His fever had worsened, rising and falling in uneven waves that left him weak and trembling. At some point, his cough had deepened into something more painful, each sound cutting through the silence of the small room like a warning Omotola could no longer ignore. As she prepared to leave, tying the faded strings of her worn uniform, Tunde reached for her weakly. "Please, don't go today," he whispered. Omotola paused at the doorway. For a brief moment, her entire world seemed to narrow into that single space between staying and leaving. Every instinct in her wanted to sit beside him, to hold his hand, to refuse the world outside and its endless demands. But reality was not kind enough to allow such choices. "I have to," she said gently, forcing calm into her voice. "I'll come back early. I promise." Tunde nodded, though his tired eyes revealed doubt. Omotola stepped out into the morning light, carrying with her a promise she was not sure she could keep. When she arrived at Golden Plate Lounge, she immediately sensed that something was different. The restaurant felt more polished than usual, more controlled, as if every detail had been carefully arranged to impress unseen eyes. Extra staff moved quickly. Across the floor tables were set with finer cutlery, and even Madame Bose carried herself with an unusual alertness, her sharp gaze scanning every corner. "Listen carefully," Madame Bose announced, gathering the staff with a commanding voice. "We have important guests today. You will not make mistakes." Her eyes settled briefly on Omotola, and the weight of that gaze was unmistakable. "Especially you." "Yes, Ma," Omotola replied softly, lowering her head. "You will serve only when instructed. No unnecessary movement, no distractions, and under no circumstances are you to go outside. Is that clear?" "Yes, Ma." Omotola understood that this was not just a warning. It was a boundary drawn specifically around her, as if her presence alone carried risk. As the day progressed, the restaurant filled with unfamiliar faces. Men dressed in tailored suits spoke in low, confident tones, while women adorned in elegant fabrics carried themselves with quiet authority. Their laughter was controlled, their gestures deliberate, and their presence filled the room with a kind of power Omotola could feel without fully understanding. She moved among them carefully, assisting where needed, speaking only when necessary. Her body felt weak, her movements slightly slower than usual, but she forced herself to maintain composure. Today was not a day for mistakes. At one point, Madame Bose instructed her to assist Kemi at one of the larger tables near the center of the room. Omotola followed quietly, keeping her eyes lowered as she placed glasses of water in front of the guests. She tried not to notice the way they barely acknowledged her presence, as though she were simply another object in the room. Then, as she turned to step away, she heard a voice. It was calm, steady, and familiar in a way that sent a sudden stillness through her entire body. For a brief second, Omotola froze. Her heart skipped, her breath catching, as something deep within her stirred with recognition. Slowly, almost without thinking, she began to lift her gaze. But before her eyes could settle, Madame Bose's voice cut sharply through the air. Omotola. She flinched and turned immediately. Yes, ma? Where is your focus? Madame Bose demanded, her tone cold and unforgiving. Are you here to serve? Or to stare at customers? I'm sorry, ma. Sorry will not correct your behavior, Madame Bose replied sternly. You will learn discipline, or you will learn consequences. The surrounding guests glanced briefly in their direction. Some looked amused, others indifferent. Kemi stood nearby, her expression unreadable, but edged with quiet satisfaction. Omotola lowered her head again and stepped away, her hands tightening slightly as she returned to her tasks. But the moment had already shifted something inside her. That voice, it lingered in her mind, refusing to fade. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Omotola continued her duties, moving from table to table, clearing plates and responding to orders. Yet her thoughts drifted, constantly returning to that single moment, that single sound she could not explain. By the time evening approached, the atmosphere in the restaurant grew even more intense. The final group of guests was expected, and Madame Bose's tension became almost visible in the way she moved and spoke. When the sleek black car finally pulled up outside, every staff member near the entrance straightened instinctively. Madame Bose hurried forward, her entire demeanor shifting into one of eager respect. Welcome, sir, she said warmly, her voice now soft and polished. Omotola stood further back, watching quietly, her curiosity rising despite her exhaustion. The car door opened and a man stepped out. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his posture straight, his presence commanding in a way that required no announcement. There was a quiet authority in the way he moved, as if the space around him adjusted itself without effort. Omotola's breath caught. There was something about him, something familiar, and yet everything about him seemed entirely different from anything she had known. As he entered the restaurant, his gaze moved slowly across the room, observant and composed. It was not the hurried glance of a guest looking for comfort, but the measured attention of someone accustomed to being in control. Then suddenly his eyes stopped. On her. Omotola froze. Her heart began to beat faster, her fingers tightening around the tray she held as she tried to steady herself. For a brief moment, the noise of the restaurant seemed to fade, leaving only that silent exchange between them. There was no confusion in his expression, no hesitation, only recognition. A calm, knowing recognition that sent a quiet shock through her. Madame Bose followed his gaze and immediately noticed the pause. Omotola. She snapped under her breath, her tone sharp again. Move. Omotola blinked, forcing herself back into the present. Yes, ma, she said quickly, stepping aside. But her mind was no longer steady, because in that moment, something impossible had begun to take shape. The man standing before her, dressed in power and respect, carried the same presence, the same calm depth she had seen in the old man outside the restaurant. The connection made no sense, and yet she could not ignore it. As the evening continued, Omotola moved through her duties, as though walking through a distant memory. She served, cleaned, responded, but her thoughts remained fixed on that single realization that refused to settle. Each time she glanced in his direction, she saw it again, that quiet, unwavering composure, that same gaze that seemed to see more than what was visible. And slowly, without fully understanding how or why, a question began to form in her mind. Who was he? Because whoever he truly was, she knew deep within her that her life had just crossed a line it could never return from. That night, long after the final guests had left and the polished floors of Golden Plate Lounge reflected nothing but dim light and exhaustion, Omotola remained behind. Her body moved on instinct as she wiped down tables and stacked chairs, but her mind was far from the restaurant. It lingered in that single moment, those eyes, that voice, that impossible recognition she could not explain. She had tried to dismiss it, tried to convince herself it was only her imagination, a trick played by exhaustion and hunger. But the more she thought about it, the less convincing that explanation became, because she knew what she had seen, and she knew what she had felt. There had been no confusion in his gaze. He had recognized her. Still dreaming, Kemi's voice cut through her thoughts. Omotola didn't turn immediately. She finished wiping the table before answering. "I'm working," she said quietly. Kemi walked closer, her heels clicking softly against the floor. There was something deliberate in the way she moved, something that suggested she had been watching Omotola for longer than she let on. "You've been distracted all evening," Kemi said, folding her arms. "Careful, Madame Bose notices everything." Omotola nodded slightly. "I know." Kemi leaned against the edge of a table, lowering her voice. "You saw him, didn't you?" Omotola's hand paused for just a second. "Who?" she asked, though the answer was already clear. Kemi smiled faintly. "The man who arrived in that car. Everyone is talking about him. They say he's one of the most powerful businessmen in the city." Omotola said nothing. Kemi's smile sharpened. "And the way you were staring at him," she added softly. "Almost like you knew him." Omotola turned, then meeting her gaze. "I don't," she said. Kemi held her eyes for a moment longer, as if searching for something beneath the surface. Then she shrugged. "Just be careful," she said. "People like him don't notice people like us. And when they do, it usually doesn't end well." Omotola didn't respond, because part of her wasn't sure that was true anymore. When she finally left the restaurant, the night air felt heavier than usual. She walked quickly through the dim streets, her thoughts racing, her body aching with every step. But as she approached the familiar corner near the entrance of the restaurant, she slowed. Baba Adewale was not there. The empty space felt strange, unsettling. For days, he had been a quiet constant in her life, someone who existed outside the cruelty of the world she moved through every day. And now, he was gone. Omotola stood there for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she turned and continued home. Inside the small room, Tunde's condition had worsened. His breathing was shallow, his skin burning with fever, his small body trembling under the thin sheet. Omotola rushed to his side immediately. "Tunde!" she whispered, touching his face. He opened his eyes weakly. "You're late," he murmured. "I'm here now," she said quickly, trying to steady her voice. But fear was rising again, stronger this time. She dipped the cloth into the bowl of water and placed it on his forehead, her movements gentle but urgent. "We need to go to the hospital," she said softly. Tunde shook his head. "We don't have money." Omotola closed her eyes briefly. "I will find a way." But the words felt hollow now, because she had already tried and failed. The next morning came with no miracle, no improvement, only the same fever, the same weakness, the same growing urgency. Omotola arrived at work with a determination she could not afford to lose. Today she needed something to change. Anything. But what she walked into was not opportunity. It was something else entirely. "Omotola," Madame Bose called sharply as soon as she entered. "Yes, ma. Come here." Omotola stepped forward, her heart already beginning to tighten. Madame Bose stood near the counter, her expression unreadable. Beside her stood Kemi, and on the table between them was a small metal cash box, open, empty. A cold feeling spread through Omotola's chest. "What happened, Ma?" she asked quietly. Madame Bose's eyes locked onto hers. "Money is missing," she said. Silence fell around them. The few staff nearby slowed their movements, their attention drawn toward the tension building in the room. Omotola's breath caught. I don't understand," she said. Madame Bose's expression hardened. "Don't pretend," she replied. "You were seen near the office last night." Omotola shook her head immediately. "I was cleaning tables. I didn't go near the office." Kemi stepped forward slightly. "I saw her," she said calmly. "She went in when no one was there." Omotola turned to her, her eyes wide. "That's not true," she said. Kemi met her gaze without hesitation. "Then explain why the money is gone," she replied. Omotola's heart began to pound. "I didn't take anything," she said, her voice shaking slightly now. "I swear." Madame Bose stepped closer. "You asked for an advance yesterday," she said coldly. "You said your brother is sick. You needed money." Omotola's throat tightened. "Yes, Ma, but I didn't." "And now money is missing," Madame Bose interrupted. "What should I think I didn't steal it?" Omotola said louder this time. A few heads turned. Whispers began. "Lower your voice," Madame Bose snapped. "You are already in enough trouble." Omotola's hands trembled at her sides. "I have nothing," she said. "If I had taken it, would I still be here?" But the logic didn't matter, not in a place where suspicion had already found its target. Search her, Madame Bose said suddenly. The words landed like a blow. Omotola froze. Ma, please. Search her, Madame Bose repeated. Kemi stepped forward without hesitation. No, Omotola said, stepping back. But it was too late. Kemi reached for her bag, opened it, and within seconds, she pulled something out. A bundle of cash. The room went silent. Omotola stared at it, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. No, she whispered. That's not mine. Kemi held it up. It was in her bag, she said simply. Madame Bose's face hardened into something final. You have embarrassed this establishment for the last time, she said. Omotola shook her head, panic rising. I didn't do this. Someone put it there. Enough, Madame Bose snapped. I warned you. Tears filled Omotola's eyes now, not from shame, but from helplessness. My brother is sick, she said, her voice breaking. I would never do this. But her words carried no weight. Not here, not anymore. You are dismissed, Madame Bose said coldly. Leave now. The words echoed in the room. Final, unchangeable. Omotola stood there for a moment, frozen, broken. Then slowly, she turned and walked out. No one stopped her. No one defended her. No one cared. Outside, the world continued as it always did. Unmoved, unaware. And for the first time since everything began, Omotola felt something inside her begin to crack. Not her strength, not yet, but something close. Because she had lost the one thing she had left, her job, her only chance, her last hope. And she didn't know what would come next. But somewhere, unseen, the truth was already waiting. Omotola did not remember how long she walked after leaving the restaurant. The noise of Lagos surrounded her as always, cars, honking vendors, shouting people, arguing, laughing, living, but none of it reached her. It was as if she had stepped out of the world without anyone noticing. Her hands felt empty, not just physically, but in a way that reached deeper than she could explain. She had nothing left, no job, no money, no way forward, only Tunde, and the fear that she might not be able to save him. By the time she reached their room, the sun had already begun to set. She pushed the door open slowly, her heart pounding harder with every second. Tunde, she called, softly. There was no answer. Her chest tightened. Tunde. She rushed inside. He was there, still on the mattress, still breathing, but weaker than before. His body seemed smaller somehow, swallowed by the thin sheet that barely covered him. His lips were dry, his face pale beneath the fever that refused to leave. Omotola dropped to her knees beside him. I'm here, she whispered, her voice trembling now. I'm here. Tunde's eyes opened slowly. You're back, he murmured. Omotola forced a smile. Yes, but he could see it. The emptiness. The silence behind her words. What happened? He asked weakly. Omotola hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing," she said. Another lie. But this one felt heavier than all the others. Tunde studied her face for a moment, then nodded. He didn't push. He never did. That night was the longest Omotola had ever lived through. She sat beside him, changing the cloth on his forehead, whispering softly, when he stirred, watching every breath as if it might be his last. Her stomach burned with hunger. Her body screamed for rest, but she didn't move. She couldn't. Because if she closed her eyes, even for a second, she feared something would happen. At some point, Tunde's breathing grew weaker. "Omotola," he whispered. "Yes, I'm here. I'm tired." Her heart stopped. "No," she said, quickly. "You're just sick. You'll get better." But her voice was no longer steady. Tunde looked at her and smiled faintly. "You always say that." Tears filled her eyes. "Because it's true." He didn't argue. He just closed his eyes again. When morning came, nothing had changed, except everything had become more urgent. Omotola made her decision without speaking it aloud. They could not stay there. They could not wait. She had no money for a hospital, no one to ask for help, no place to go. But she could not watch him fade in that room. She wrapped Tunde carefully in the thin cloth they owned and lifted him into her arms. He was lighter than he should have been. That frightened her more than anything. "Hold on," she whispered, as she stepped outside. The sun was already rising. The city was already moving, and she stepped into it with nothing but desperation guiding her. She walked toward the nearest clinic first, a small building with peeling paint and a crowded entrance. "Please," she said at the desk, her voice urgent. "My brother is very sick." The woman behind the counter barely looked up. "Registration fee," she said flatly. "I don't have money now," Omotola replied. "But I will pay. I promise." The woman shook her head. "No payment, no treatment." Omotola's grip tightened around Tunde. "Please," she said again, her voice breaking now. "He needs help." Next the woman called, already looking past her. Omotola stood there for a moment, then turned and walked away. The second clinic was no different, nor the third. Each door closed in the same way. Each voice carried the same message: no money, no help. By midday, the sun burned overhead. Omotola's steps grew slower. Her arms ached from carrying Tunde. Her body trembled with exhaustion. But she kept moving, because stopping meant giving up. At one point she stumbled, falling to her knees in the dust of the roadside. Tunde shifted weakly in her arms. "Sorry," she whispered quickly, holding him closer. A few people glanced in her direction, then looked away. Life continued, as it always did. She sat there for a moment, her breath uneven, her vision blurred by heat and tears. And then a thought came to her. The restaurant. Not because she expected help, but because she had nowhere else to go. Slowly, painfully, she stood up again and turned back. When she reached Golden Plate Lounge, the doors were open. Customers moved in and out. Laughter filled the air. Nothing had changed. Except her. She stood outside for a moment, unsure, unwelcome. Then she stepped closer. Hey. A security guard blocked her path. No begging here. I'm not begging, Omotola said quickly. I used to work here. I just need to speak to Madame Bose. The guard looked at her, then at the child in her arms. His expression hardened. She doesn't want to see you. Please, Omotola said, her voice desperate now. My brother is very sick. Move, he said firmly. Don't cause trouble. Omotola stepped back. Her last option, gone. She turned slowly, her legs weak, her mind empty. And then she saw him, Baba Adewale, sitting in the same place as before, as if nothing had changed, as if he had been waiting. Omotola walked toward him, her steps unsteady. When she reached him, she could no longer hold it in. He's dying, she said. The words came out raw, broken, real. Baba Adewale looked at Tunde, then at her. His calm expression did not change, but his eyes softened. You have carried this alone for too long, he said quietly. Omotola shook her head. I don't have anyone else. Silence. Heavy, still. Then slowly, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small. A piece of bread. Dry, hard, barely enough for one person. She looked at it, then at him. I was saving it for him, she said softly. But you haven't eaten. Her hands trembled as she held it out. Baba Adewale did not take it immediately. He looked at her, long, deep, as if measuring something far beyond what was visible. You are giving when you have nothing left, he said. Omotola nodded, tears falling freely now. I don't know what else to do. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Then Baba Adewale reached out, but not for the bread. He placed his hand gently over hers, and in that touch, something shifted, something unseen. Because what Omotola did not know was that this moment, this final act of kindness, in the face of complete loss, was the one that would change everything. Not just for her, but for everyone who had ever doubted her. And very soon, the truth would no longer remain hidden. The heat of the afternoon pressed down on Lagos like a weight that refused to lift, and Omotola felt it in every step she took. Her arms ached from carrying Tunde. Her legs trembled beneath her, and her mind felt stretched between hope and despair. After leaving Baba Adewale, she had not stopped, because she couldn't, because stopping meant facing the truth she was not ready to accept. Tunde's breathing had become shallower, his small body growing weaker with every passing moment. Each time he shifted in her arms, Omotola tightened her grip, whispering softly, as if her voice alone could hold him here. You're going to be okay? She repeated again and again, though her own heart no longer believed it fully. The streets blurred as she moved through them, asking anyone who might listen. Please, do you know a place that will treat him? I will pay later. Some shook their heads. Some ignored her completely. A few paused long enough to look at the child in her arms before turning away. It was not cruelty. It was survival. Everyone had their own battles to fight. At one point, she reached a larger hospital. Its tall gates and clean exterior made it look like a place where hope lived. She stepped forward quickly. "Please," she said at the reception desk, her voice trembling but urgent. "My brother needs help." The nurse glanced at her briefly, then at Tunde. "Emergency deposit," she said. "I don't have it now," Omotola replied. "But I will work. I will do anything. Just help him first." The nurse hesitated for a second, then shook her head. "We can't admit him without payment." Omotola felt something inside her collapse. "He won't make it if we wait," she whispered. "I'm sorry," the nurse replied, her voice softer now, but no less final. Omotola stood there, frozen. The world moved around her. People passed. Voices rose and fell. But all she could hear was the silence of doors closing. She walked out slowly, her steps unsteady, her vision blurred. For the first time, the thought came clearly. What if she couldn't save him? The idea hit her like a physical blow. "No?" she whispered under her breath. "No? No?" She shook her head, as if she could force the thought away. But it stayed. By the time the sun began to lower, Omotola had nothing left to give. Not strength, not hope, not even tears. She found herself near a shaded area by the roadside and sank down slowly, her body finally giving in to exhaustion. Tunde shifted weakly in her arms. "Omotola," he whispered. "I'm here," she said immediately, holding him closer. "I'm cold." Her heart tightened. The heat around them was unbearable, yet he felt cold. She wrapped her arms around him more tightly, trying to warm him with what little strength she had left. "You'll be okay," she said again, though her voice barely carried now. Tunde was quiet for a moment. Then he spoke again. "You shouldn't have lost your job. Because of me." The words struck her deeply. "It's not your fault," she said quickly. "I heard them yesterday," he murmured, "when they shouted at you about the money." Omotola closed her eyes briefly. "I didn't take it," she said. "I know." Tunde replied softly. That simple trust cut deeper than anything else. They sat there in silence for a while. The world continued to move around them. Cars passed. People walked by. Life carried on. And then a shadow fell across them. Omotola looked up slowly. A man stood in front of her, well-dressed, composed. His presence quiet, but undeniable. It was him, not as Baba Adewale, but as the man she had seen the night before. Omotola's breath caught. Her mind struggled to catch up with what her eyes already knew. He looked at Tunde first, carefully, then at her. "You should have come sooner," he said. His voice was calm, steady, familiar. Omotola stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. I didn't know where to go," she said finally. The man nodded slightly, then turned to the driver behind him. "Call ahead," he said quietly. "Tell them we're bringing a patient." The driver moved immediately. No hesitation, no questions. Omotola blinked, confused, overwhelmed. What is happening?" she asked. The man looked at her again, and for the first time, there was something different in his eyes. Not just calm, not just understanding, but decision. "Your brother needs treatment," he said simply. Omotola shook her head slightly. "I don't have money," she said. "I can't—" "You already gave what you had," he replied. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning. Omotola felt her chest tighten. You knew?" she asked. The man did not answer directly. Instead, he stepped closer. "Come," he said. "There is no more time to waste." Something in his tone left no room for doubt, no room for hesitation. Omotola looked down at Tunde, then back at him, and in that moment, she made a choice. She stood up slowly, carefully, still holding Tunde close. The car door opened. For the first time that day, something shifted. Not fully, not completely, but enough. As they drove through the city, Omotola sat in silence, her arms wrapped around her brother, her mind struggling to process everything that had just happened. The man sat across from her, calm, composed, watching. "Why are you helping us?" she asked quietly. He met her gaze. "Because you helped me," he said. Omotola's breath caught again. "But I didn't know who you were," she said. He nodded. "That is why it matters." Silence filled the car once more. But this time, it felt different. Whoops. But waiting. Because what Omotola did not yet fully understand was that this moment was not just about help. It was about truth. A truth that had been hidden in plain sight. A truth that would soon change everything. And as the car sped toward the hospital, the line between the life she had known and the life she was about to step into began to disappear. For the first time in a long while, Omotola allowed herself to hope. The hospital they arrived at was nothing like the ones Omotola had visited earlier that day. Even before the car came to a full stop, she could see the difference. The building stood tall and clean, its glass reflecting the fading light of evening. There were no crowded entrances, no raised voices arguing over fees, no exhausted patients waiting endlessly on worn benches. Everything appeared orderly, controlled, and distant from the chaos she had known. The car door opened before she could gather her thoughts. "Careful," the driver said quietly, stepping forward to assist. Omotola tightened her hold on Tunde and stepped out slowly. Her legs felt weak after everything she had endured, but she refused to let that show. Not now, not when they were finally at a place where help might be possible. The man who had brought them here stepped out on the other side, his presence immediately drawing attention from the staff near the entrance. A nurse hurried forward, followed closely by another staff member pushing a wheelchair. "They've been informed, sir," the nurse said respectfully. He gave a slight nod. "Take the boy," he said calmly. For a brief moment, Omotola hesitated. Her arms tightened instinctively around Tunda, as though letting go might cause him to slip away from her entirely. But when she looked down at his face, pale, fragile, barely conscious, she knew she could not hold on out of fear. Slowly, she allowed the nurse to take him. "I'm here," she whispered, as they placed him into the wheelchair. "I'm not leaving you." Tunde's eyes flickered slightly, but he said nothing. They moved quickly after that, through wide corridors that smelled faintly of antiseptic, and something else, something cleaner, something unfamiliar. The lights were bright but not harsh, and the silence was broken only by soft footsteps and quiet instructions exchanged between staff. Omotola followed closely, her heart racing, her thoughts struggling to keep pace with everything happening around her. They entered a treatment room, and within seconds more staff surrounded Tundi. A doctor stepped forward, his expression focused as he began giving instructions. "High fever," he said. "Possible infection. Prepare fluids immediately." Omotola stood frozen near the doorway, unsure where to go, unsure what to do. She watched as they worked around her brother with a speed and efficiency she had never seen before. No one asked for money. No one stopped them. No one turned her away. It felt unreal. After a few moments, the man who had brought her here stepped beside her. "He is in good hands," he said. Omotola nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on Tunde. "Thank you," she said, quietly. The words felt small compared to everything he had done, but they were all she had. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched the scene before them, his expression unreadable. "You tried to bring him earlier today," he said, after a moment. Omotola turned slightly surprised. "Yes," she replied, "but they wouldn't help us." He nodded once. "I know." The certainty in his voice made her pause. "You know she asked." He did not explain. Instead, he looked at her more directly, now his gaze steady but not unkind. "Sit," he said gently. "You have done enough for today." Omotola hesitated. She had not allowed herself to rest, not even for a moment, since morning. The idea of sitting down felt almost foreign, but her body made the decision for her. She lowered herself slowly into the chair nearby, her legs trembling as they finally gave in to exhaustion. For a moment, she simply breathed, in, out, slowly, as if she was relearning something she had forgotten. Time passed in a quiet blur. Doctors came and went. Nurses checked and adjusted equipment. Tunde remained still, his small body connected to machines Omotola did not fully understand, but which she trusted more than anything she had seen that day. Eventually, the doctor returned. "He will be okay," he said. The words settled over her like something fragile. Omotola blinked. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor nodded. "Yes. He needed treatment, and now he is receiving it. You brought him in time." Omotola felt something inside her loosen. Not completely, not yet, but enough for her to breathe again. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. The doctor gave a small nod and left the room. Silence followed. A different kind of silence. Not heavy, not suffocating, but calm. Omotola sat there for a long moment before turning to the man beside her. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "Why are they listening to you? Who are you?" The question had been building inside her since the moment she saw him step out of that car. Now she could no longer hold it back. The man looked at her, not quickly, not dismissively, but with the same steady attention he had shown her from the beginning. "You already know me," he said. Omotola shook her head. "No," she replied. "I thought I did, but I don't." He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the truth in her words. "My name is Adewale Ogunleo," he said. The name meant nothing at first. It was just a name. But then something shifted. A memory, a whisper, a conversation she had overheard in the restaurant. One of the most powerful businessmen in the city. A man people spoke about with respect, sometimes fear. Omotola's eyes widened slightly. You are... He did not finish the sentence for her. He did not need to. "I am the man you shared your food with," he said simply. The room felt still again. Omotola stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the image of the quiet, barefoot man outside the restaurant with the one sitting before her, now composed, respected, undeniably powerful. Why, she asked. The word carried everything she could not fully express. Why had he been there? Why had he hidden himself? Why had he watched her suffer? Why had he waited? Adewale did not answer immediately. He looked toward Tunde for a moment, then back at her. "Because people reveal who they truly are when they believe no one important is watching," he said. Omotola lowered her gaze slightly. "And what did you see?" she asked. He held her eyes. "I saw someone who gives when she has nothing," he replied. The words landed softly, but deeply. Omotola felt her chest tighten again. Not from pain this time, but from something she could not fully name. "I didn't do it for anything," she said quietly. "I didn't know who you were." "I know," he replied, "and that is why it matters." Silence settled between them once more, but it was no longer filled with confusion. Now it carried something else, understanding. Omotola looked at Tunde again. His breathing had steadied. His face looked calmer. For the first time in days, he looked like a child who might recover. She exhaled slowly, then turned back to Adewale. "What happens now?" she asked. It was not just about the hospital, not just about Tunde. It was about everything. Her job, her future, her life. Adewale studied her for a moment, then spoke. Now he said, "We make things right." The words were simple, but something in his tone made them feel like a promise, not just of help, but of something more, something bigger. And as Omotola sat there watching her brother breathe, listening to the quiet certainty in his voice, she realized that the story she thought had ended outside that restaurant had only just begun. Omotola did not sleep that night. Even though the hospital room was quiet, even though Tunda's breathing had finally steadied, and even though her body was crying out for rest, her mind refused to settle. Too much had changed in too short a time, and every answer she received seemed to open another question she did not yet know how to ask. She sat beside Tunda's bed, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, as if afraid that if she looked away, something might shift again. The machines beside him hummed softly, their steady rhythm becoming the only thing she trusted. Across the room, Adewale Ogunle stood by the window, his silhouette calm against the dim city lights outside. He had not left since they arrived. He had made a few quiet calls, spoken to staff in low tones, and then returned to that same still position, as though waiting for something. Or perhaps she thought waiting for her. "You should rest," he said without turning. Omotola looked at him, but did not move. "I'm fine," she replied. It was not entirely true, but it was easier than explaining the storm inside her. Adewale turned slowly, his gaze steady. "You have been fine for too long," he said. "And it has cost you more than it should have." Omotola lowered her eyes slightly. "I didn't have a choice." "There is always a choice," he replied calmly, "but not always an easy one." She didn't argue, because deep down, she knew he was right. And yet, knowing that did not make her past decisions easier to carry. After a moment, she spoke again. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. The question had been waiting since the moment he revealed his name. Adewale watched her carefully. "If I had," he said, "would you have acted differently?" Omotola hesitated. She thought of the food she had given at home, the coin, the bread, the conversations they had shared without expectation. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Adewale nodded. "That is exactly why I didn't tell you," he said. Omotola frowned slightly. "I don't understand. If people know who I am," he explained, "they act based on what they think I can give them, not based on who they are." Omotola absorbed his words slowly. "And you wanted to see who I really am?" she asked. "I already saw it the first day," he replied. "Everything after that only confirmed it." She looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. There was no pride in what she had done, no sense of achievement, only the quiet understanding that she had simply done what felt right even when it cost her. "I lost everything because of that," she said softly. Adewale stepped closer. "No," he said, "you revealed everything." The difference settled between them, subtle, but powerful. Omotola exhaled slowly, then looked up again. "They said I stole," she said. Her voice carried a deeper weight now. Not anger, but hurt. A wound that had not yet begun to heal. "I know," Adewale replied. Her eyes widened slightly. "You know," she repeated. He nodded. "I had people watching the restaurant. After I left," he said. "What happened to you was not an accident. Omotola's chest tightened. "Yummy?" she whispered, and Madame Bose Adewale added. The confirmation felt like a quiet blow. "I told them the truth," she said, "but no one listened." "They weren't meant to," he replied. Omotola looked at him confused. "What do you mean?" Adewale held her gaze. "They had already decided who you were," he said. "The truth would only matter if they were willing to see it." Omotola felt something stir inside her, a mix of pain and clarity. "So what happens now?" she asked. Adewale did not hesitate. "Now we give them no choice but to see it." The weight of his words lingered in the room. Omotola looked at Tunde again, her heart softening as she watched him sleep more peacefully than he had in days. Then she turned back. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly. Adewale's expression did not change. "This is not about revenge," he replied. "Then what is it about?" "It is about truth," he said, "and accountability." Omotola considered that. For so long she had lived in a world where survival came before fairness, where enduring quietly was often the only option. The idea that something could be set right not through anger but through truth felt unfamiliar. "I don't want to become like them," she said. "You won't," Adewale replied, "because your choices are not driven by fear or greed." She held his gaze for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. Later that morning, a nurse entered the room. "He's responding well," she said with a gentle smile. "The fever is coming down." Omotola felt her shoulders relax slightly. "Can I sit with him?" she asked. "Of course." As the nurse left, Omotola reached for Tunde's hand. His fingers moved slightly in response. "I told you," she whispered softly. "You're going to be okay." For the first time since everything began, she believed it. By midday, Adewale had made arrangements. He spoke briefly with the doctor, signed a few documents, and then returned to Omotola. "We will go back to the restaurant tomorrow," he said. Omotola looked up. "To Golden Plate?" she asked. "Yes." Her chest tightened again. The thought of returning there brought back everything. The accusations, the humiliation the moment she walked out with nothing. "I don't belong there anymore," she said. Adewale shook his head slightly. "You were never meant to belong to the version of that place they showed you," he said. "But that does not mean it cannot change." Omotola studied his face. "You're going to confront them," she said. "Yes." "And you want me there?" "Yes." She hesitated. Not out of fear, but because she knew what it would mean. It would mean facing them again, standing in the same space where she had been broken, and choosing not to run. "I'm not afraid of them," she said quietly. Adewale nodded. "I know." "Then why does this feel so difficult?" "Because it matters," he replied. That answer stayed with her. Because it was true. As the day continued, Omotola remained by Tunde's side, her thoughts slowly settling into something steadier. For the first time in a long while, she was not just reacting to what life threw at her. She was preparing for something for a moment that had not yet arrived. That night, as the city lights flickered outside the hospital window, Omotola allowed herself to close her eyes. Not in fear, not in exhaustion, but in quiet trust. Because tomorrow, everything would be brought into the light. And for once, she would not be standing alone. Morning arrived with a calm that felt almost unfamiliar to Omotola. For days, every sunrise had brought with it urgency fear and the weight of decisions she was forced to make with nothing in her hands. But this morning was different. Tunde's fever had finally broken, and his breathing, though still weak, carried a steadiness that allowed her to breathe with him instead of against time. She sat beside his bed, watching as he stirred slightly. "Omotola!" He murmured, his voice still faint but clearer than before. "I'm here," she said quickly, leaning closer. He blinked slowly, adjusting to the light. "Where are we?" he asked. "A hospital," she replied softly. "You're safe." Tunde's gaze shifted around the room, confusion flickering briefly, before settling into quiet acceptance. "You look tired," he said. Omotola smiled gently. "I've been worse." Tunde studied her face for a moment, then nodded as if choosing not to question what he did not yet understand. "You'll tell me later," he said. "I will," she promised. And this time, it did not feel like a lie. By the time the doctor returned for his morning check, Tunde was sitting up, slightly supported by pillows. "He's responding very well," the doctor said. "We'll keep him under observation for a few more days, but the danger has passed." Omotola felt relief settle fully for the first time. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with sincerity. The doctor nodded, then glanced briefly toward Adewale, who stood near the window. "We've followed all your instructions," he added respectfully. Adewale inclined his head slightly. "Good." The exchange was brief, but it did not escape Omotola's notice. The respect in the doctor's tone, the quiet authority in Adewale's response, it reminded her again that she was standing in a world she did not yet fully understand. After the doctor left, she turned to Adewale. "You've done more than enough," she said. "I don't know how to repay you." Adewale shook his head. "This is not a debt," he replied. "It is a response. To what? To who you chose to be when no one was watching." Omotola lowered her gaze slightly, absorbing the weight of that answer. Later that afternoon, Adewale made a call that would begin to unravel everything that had been hidden. "I want the full report," he said calmly into the phone. "No assumptions, only facts." There was a pause on the other end. "And the footage," he continued. Another pause. "Good. Bring it to me." He ended the call and turned to Omotola. "They have it," he said. What she asked. The truth. The word lingered in the room. Omotola felt her chest tighten slightly. All of it she asked. All of it he confirmed. By evening, the evidence arrived. A man dressed in a simple suit entered the hospital room quietly, carrying a slim device. He nodded respectfully to Adewale before placing it on the table. "This is everything from the security cameras over the past week," he said, "including the night of the incident." Adewale thanked him and dismissed him with a brief gesture. Omotola watched silently, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers tightening slightly, as the moment she had both feared and longed for began to take shape. "Come," Adewale said, gesturing toward the chair beside him. She hesitated only briefly before standing and moving closer. The screen flickered to life. At first, the footage showed ordinary scenes, staff moving through the restaurant, customers dining, the routine of a place she knew too well. But then the time shifted. The night she had been accused. Omotola leaned forward slightly, her breath slowing as she watched. There she was, cleaning tables, moving from one side of the room to the other, aware of what was about to happen. Then the image changed. The camera outside the office door. Kemi appeared. She glanced around carefully, checking to see if anyone was watching. Omotola felt her chest tighten. "No," she whispered. Kemi slipped into the office. Moments later, Madame Bose followed. They spoke briefly, too quietly for the camera to capture sound, but their body language was clear, intentional, coordinated. Then came the moment. Kemi placed something into her bag. A small bundle. The same bundle that had later been found. Omotola's breath caught. Her vision blurred slightly, not from confusion, but from the overwhelming clarity of it all. "I told them," she whispered. "I know," Adewale replied calmly. The footage continued. Kemi left the office. Madame Bose followed shortly after, locking the door behind her as if nothing had happened. Then the scene shifted again. The next morning, the accusation, the search, the moment everything had been taken from her. But now, it looked different. Now it was not her against their words. Now it was truth against their lies. Omotola leaned back slowly, her hands trembling slightly. For a long moment, she said nothing. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because the weight of being right and unheard was heavier than she expected. They knew, she said finally. "Yes," Adewale replied. "They planned it." "Yes," and no one questioned it. Adewale looked at her. "They didn't need to," he said. "You were the easiest person to blame." Omotola closed her eyes briefly, not in pain, but in understanding. For so long she had lived with quiet acceptance of how the world worked. But now, seeing it so clearly, so undeniably, it felt different. It felt final. "What happens now?" she asked. Adewale's expression remained calm. "Now we bring this into the light." Omotola nodded slowly. She was ready. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she no longer wanted to carry what was never hers to begin with. The next morning, arrangements were made. A meeting was called at Golden Plate Lounge. All staff were required to attend, management included. No exceptions. The message was clear. No explanation. Only presence required. When Omotola stood outside the restaurant once more, it felt like standing at the edge of something she had already crossed. The glass doors reflected her image back at her, but she was not the same girl who had walked out of them days ago. She stood straighter now. Not because her life had suddenly become easy, but because she no longer questioned her own truth. Beside her, Adewale stood quietly, not leading, not pushing, simply present. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," he said. Omotola shook her head. "I am," she replied. And this time, there was no hesitation. Together, they stepped inside. And for the first time, the story that had been twisted against her was about to be told the way it truly happened. The moment Omotola stepped back into Golden Plate Lounge, the air felt different. It was the same polished floor, the same neatly arranged tables, the same carefully controlled atmosphere, but now every detail seemed sharper, more exposed. The place that had once felt like her only chance at survival now stood before her as something else entirely. A space where truth had been buried and was about to be uncovered. Staff members were already gathered. Kemi stood near the counter, her posture stiff, despite the casual way she tried to lean against it. Saad stood a little apart, her eyes moving between faces, uncertain of what was about to unfold. Other workers whispered quietly among themselves, their voices low but restless. Madame Bose stood at the center, composed, controlled, but not entirely calm. Her eyes moved toward the entrance as Omotola walked in. For a brief moment something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, but it disappeared almost instantly, replaced by the familiar sharpness she wore like armor. "So, you decided to come back?" she said coldly. Omotola did not lower her gaze this time. "I didn't come back for a job," she replied quietly. A murmur spread through the room. Madame Bose's expression tightened slightly. "Then why are you here?" she asked. Before Omotola could answer, the room shifted. Because someone else had entered. Adewale Ogunlai. His presence filled the space without effort. Conversations stopped. Movements slowed. Even those who did not recognize him immediately felt something change. Madame Bose turned, and this time her composure faltered. "Sir," she said, her voice suddenly softer, more controlled. "We were not informed." "You were informed to be present?" Adewale replied calmly. Nothing more was required. The simplicity of his tone carried authority that needed no explanation. Madame Bose straightened slightly. "Yes, sir?" Her eyes moved briefly toward Omotola again. This time, the calculation in them was unmistakable. Adewale stepped further into the room. "I will not take much of your time," he said, addressing everyone now. "But what needs to be addressed will be addressed fully." Silence settled. Heavy, expectant. Omotola stood beside him, her hands steady at her sides. Her heart was beating faster, but she did not look away. Not anymore. Adewale gestured slightly. The same man who had delivered the footage at the hospital stepped forward, placing a small screen on the table. Madame Bose's eyes flickered toward it. "What is this?" she asked carefully. "The truth," Adewale replied. The word landed with quiet force. The screen came to life. At first, the footage showed ordinary scenes, the restaurant in its usual rhythm, staff moving through their duties, customers dining without concern. It was familiar, comfortably so, until it wasn't. The time stamp shifted, the night of the incident. Kemi's face tightened. Madame Bose's posture stiffened. The footage played without interruption. Kemi glancing around, entering the office. Madame Bose following shortly after. Their movements, their coordination. The moment the money was placed inside Omotola's bag, no words were needed. The room was silent. Completely. Omotola felt her breath steady. Not from relief, but from something deeper. The quiet confirmation of what she had always known. Kemi stepped back slightly. That doesn't prove anything, she said quickly, her voice no longer smooth. But it did. Everyone in the room knew it did. Adewale did not raise his voice. He did not need to. It proves intent, he said calmly. And action. Madame Bose's expression hardened. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, her tone shifting again. Perhaps the footage is incomplete. It is not, Adewale interrupted. His gaze held hers. Steady, unyielding. Kemi's composure broke first. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said suddenly, her voice rising. She was always pretending to be better than everyone. I never, Omotola began, but Adewale raised a hand slightly, not to silence her, but to steady the moment. Kemi shook her head, her words tumbling now. She made everyone look bad. Always quiet. Always. Good. And Madame Bose said, Enough! Madame Bose snapped sharply. But it was too late. The truth was no longer hidden. Adewale looked at Madame Bose. Do you deny your involvement? He asked. Madame Bose hesitated. For the first time since Omotola had known her, she did not have an immediate answer. Her silence said everything. I was protecting the reputation of this establishment, she said, finally, her voice controlled but strained. We cannot allow staff to behave carelessly. She brought a beggar into proximity of customers. She created risk. She showed humanity, Adewale said. The interruption was quiet, but absolute. Madame Bose's eyes narrowed slightly. That is not how business works, she replied. No, Adewale agreed. It is how character works. The distinction settled over the room. Clear, unavoidable. Omotola stood still, listening. Not with anger, but with clarity. For so long she had carried their version of her story. Now, she no longer had to. Adewale turned back to the group. This establishment will undergo immediate review, he said. Management decisions will be reassessed, and those responsible for misconduct will be removed. The words were simple, but their impact was immediate. Kemi's face drained of color. Madame Bose stood rigid, her authority slipping in quiet, visible pieces. Saad stepped forward slightly, her voice hesitant. She didn't steal, she said, looking at Omotola. I knew it didn't make sense. Omotola met her eyes and gave a small nod, not of triumph, but of acknowledgement. Adewale looked at Omotola then. This is where your story was taken from you, he said. What you choose to do next is yours. The room waited, not for him, but for her. Omotola took a slow breath. Her gaze moved across the faces before her. Kemi, Madame Bose, the others. She could feel the weight of the moment, the opportunity, the power. But when she spoke, her voice remained steady. "I don't want revenge," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried. Kemi blinked, surprised. Madame Bose's expression shifted slightly. "I only wanted the truth," Omotola continued. "And now it's here." She paused, then added softly, "That's enough for me." Silence followed, but it was different now. Not heavy, but released, because in that moment, Omotola had taken back something far more valuable than a job. She had taken back herself. And as she stood there, no longer defined by what others had said about her, she realized that the story had already changed, not because of what had been revealed, but because of who she had chosen to remain, even when it cost her everything. And now, everything was about to change. The silence that followed Omotola's words did not feel empty. It felt decisive. For a brief moment, no one moved, as if the entire room needed time to understand what had just happened. The truth had been revealed. The lies had been stripped away, and yet the outcome did not unfold in the way most of them had expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no demand for punishment from the one who had suffered the most. Instead, there was restraint, and that somehow carried more weight than anger ever could. Adewale stood quietly beside her, observing not just the room, but the reactions within it. He had seen many moments of reckoning in his life, moments when power shifted and truth surfaced. But this one was different. This was not driven by control or authority. It was driven by character. Madame Bose was the first to break the stillness. "You think this ends here?" she said, her voice no longer sharp but strained in a way that betrayed her uncertainty. "You walk in, show a video, and suddenly everything changes?" Adewale turned his gaze toward her. "Everything has already changed," he replied calmly. "You are only beginning to see it." Madame Bose's lips pressed together tightly. "For years I have run this place," she continued. "I built its reputation. I ensured standards were maintained. And now you stand here and question my decisions based on one situation." "It is not one situation," Adewale said. "It is a pattern." The words landed without force, yet they carried authority that could not be ignored. Madame Bose hesitated. And in that hesitation, something fragile in her position became visible. Kemi, who had been standing near the counter, shifted uneasily. "I said I didn't mean for it to go that far," she murmured again, though her voice lacked conviction. Now, the confidence she had once carried had faded, replaced by a quiet fear of consequences she could no longer avoid. Saad glanced at her, then looked away. No one stepped forward to defend her. No one stood beside her. Because the truth had drawn a line, and each person in the room now stood clearly on one side of it. Adewale took a slow step forward. "This establishment will no longer operate under the same leadership," he said. The statement was clear. Final. Madame Bose's head snapped up. "You cannot make that decision." she said quickly. You are not. I am the majority stakeholder as of this morning, Adewale interrupted. The room fell silent. Again. Completely. Omotola felt the words settle heavily around her. Majority stakeholder. The meaning was immediate. Everything she had known about that place, its rules, its power, its structure, had just shifted entirely. Madame Bose stared at him, her composure breaking for the first time. That is not possible, she said. It is done. Adewale replied simply. There was no anger in his voice, no triumph, only certainty. And that certainty removed any room for argument. Kemi's breathing grew uneven. What does that mean for us? She asked quietly. Adewale turned his attention toward her. It means accountability, he said. The word echoed through the space, not as a threat, but as a principle. Madame Bose took a step back, her mind racing to grasp what was slipping away. You're making a mistake, she said, though her voice lacked the strength it once carried. You don't understand how this place works. Adewale held her gaze. I understand exactly how it has been working, he said. That is why it will no longer continue this way. For a moment, it seemed as though Madame Bose might argue further, but she didn't, because something in his tone made it clear that this was no longer a discussion. It was a conclusion. Kemi lowered her head slightly. I can leave? She said, her voice smaller now. I don't need any trouble. You will not leave. Quietly, Adewale replied. She looked up, fear rising in her eyes. What do you mean? You made a decision that affected someone's life, he said. You will answer for it. Kemi swallowed hard. The reality of her actions was no longer distant. It was here, immediate, unavoidable. Saad shifted slightly, her hands clasped together. I didn't know what they were doing, she said softly, almost as if speaking to herself. Adewale glanced at her briefly. And you will not be judged for what you did not do, he said. The distinction mattered, and it settled differently across each person in the room. Omotola remained still. She watched everything unfold, but she did not feel the urge to step forward to speak again or to claim anything for herself. The moment no longer belonged to her pain. It belonged to the truth. And that was enough. Adewale turned back to her. This place can be rebuilt, he said quietly, but not in the way it was before. Omotola met his gaze. She understood what he was asking without him saying it directly. Opportunity, responsibility, a new path. I don't know how to run a place like this, she said honestly. You know how to treat people, he replied. She held his gaze for a moment longer. That answer felt both simple and overwhelming, because it meant more than just a job. It meant change, real change. I need time, she said. Adewale nodded. You have it. There was no pressure in his response, no expectation, only space. And for someone like Omotola, who had spent so long being forced into decisions without options, that space felt unfamiliar. but necessary. Madame Bose turned slightly, her posture no longer rigid, her presence no longer commanding. "What happens to me?" she asked quietly. Adewale looked at her. "Your role here ends today," he said. The words were not harsh, but they were final. Madame Bose closed her eyes briefly. Years of authority, gone in a moment, but not without cause. She did not argue, because there was nothing left to argue. Kemi remained silent. Sadei exhaled softly, and the rest of the staff stood as witnesses to something they would not forget. The end of one version of the story, and the beginning of another. Omotola turned toward the door. For a moment she paused, looking at the place where she had once stood uncertain, overlooked and unheard. Then she stepped forward, not as someone returning, but as someone moving beyond. Adewale followed quietly behind her. Outside, the air felt different, lighter, not because everything had been solved, but because something had been set right. Omotola took a slow breath. Her journey was not over. In many ways, it was only beginning. But now, she was no longer carrying it alone. And for the first time, that made all the difference. The days that followed did not feel like a sudden transformation. They felt like something slower, something real, not a miracle, but a rebuilding. Omotola did not return to Golden Applied Lounge immediately. Even though the door was open to her now, in a way it had never been before, she chose to stay at the hospital with Tunde until he was strong enough to walk again without trembling. That was where her world still centered. That was where her responsibility remained. Every morning she sat beside him as the light filtered through the wide hospital windows, watching as his strength slowly returned. The color came back to his face in quiet stages, and the sharp heat of fever faded into something manageable, something distant. "You look different," Tunde said one afternoon, studying her carefully. Omotola smiled faintly. "How? You're not..." Worried in the same way he replied. She thought about that for a moment. Because he was right. The fear that had once lived constantly in her chest tight, pressing, suffocating, was no longer there in the same way. It had not disappeared completely, but it had loosened. "I think I'm just breathing again," she said softly. Tunde nodded as if that answer made sense to him. "You always took care of me," he added, even when it was hard. Omotola reached for his hand. "I still will," she said. And this time, there was no uncertainty behind the promise. Adewale visited regularly, though never in a way that felt overwhelming. He did not arrive with announcements or expectations. He simply showed up, checked on Tunde, spoke with the doctors, then spoke with Omotola, not as someone above her, but as someone who had chosen to stand beside her. One evening, as the sun lowered into a soft orange glow beyond the hospital windows, he sat across from her. "The transition at the restaurant has begun," he said. Omotola listened quietly. "New management will be introduced. Policies will change. Staff will be retrained." She nodded slowly. "And Kemi?" she asked. Adewale did not avoid the question. She will face legal consequences, he replied. What she did cannot be dismissed. Omotola absorbed that. And Madame Bose. She has been removed from her position, he said. Further actions will depend on what follows. Omotola looked down briefly. There was no satisfaction in hearing it. No sense of victory. Only closure. They made their choices, she said quietly. Adewale studied her. You still don't hate them, he observed. Omotola shook her head. I don't have space for that, she said. The answer was simple, but it carried truth that many never reached. A week later, Tunde was discharged. The day they left the hospital felt like stepping into a new life, though nothing around them had physically changed. The same streets, the same noise, the same city. But everything felt different, because they were no longer walking through it in desperation. Their living situation changed soon after, not through charity, not through sudden wealth, but through opportunity. Adewale had arranged for Omotola to oversee a new initiative within his company, one that focused on providing affordable meals for those who had none. Not as a symbolic gesture, but as a real program, structured, sustainable, intentional. I don't know if I can do this, Omotola said when he first explained it. You already have, he replied. She looked at him uncertain. You fed someone when you had nothing, he continued. This is simply doing that on a larger scale. That perspective shifted something inside her. Because it did not feel like stepping into something unfamiliar. It felt like continuing something she had already begun. The first day she walked into the new kitchen, it was not polished. Like Golden Plate Lounge, it was not quiet. It was not controlled. It was alive. People moved with purpose. Food was prepared in large quantities. Voices filled the space, not with judgment, but with coordination. And at the center of it was her, not as a servant, not as someone invisible, but as someone responsible, someone trusted. At first, it felt overwhelming. The decisions, the organization, the weight of knowing that what she did would affect others. But slowly, she found her rhythm, not by trying to become someone else, but by remaining who she had always been. She listened, she observed, she treated people with the same quiet dignity she had once longed to receive. And in return, something unexpected happened. People responded, not with fear, but with respect. Tunde visited often, stronger now, laughing more easily, sometimes helping where he could, even if it was just carrying small things or sitting nearby and watching. You're the boss now, he teased one afternoon. Omotola laughed, softly. I'm just doing my work. You're doing more than that, he said. She looked at him, and for a moment she saw something she had not seen in a long time. Pride, not in her success, but in who she had remained through everything. Weeks passed, then months. Golden Plate Lounge reopened under new leadership, not as the same place it had been, but as something different, fairer, more aware. And while Omotola did not return there to work, she visited once. not to relive the past, but to acknowledge how far she had come. She stood inside for a moment, looking around. The space no longer held power over her. It was simply a place. And she was no longer the girl who had been broken within it. Adewale stood beside her. "You changed more than you realize," he said. Omotola shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "I just stayed the same." He smiled slightly. And that changed everything. As they stepped outside, the city moved around them just as it always had. But for Omotola, the meaning of it had shifted, because she now understood something she hadn't before. Kindness does not always change the world immediately. Sometimes it costs you everything first. Sometimes it leaves you standing alone, misunderstood and broken. But if it is real, if it is chosen even when there is nothing to gain, it does not disappear. It waits. And when the moment is right, it returns. Not as something small, but as something powerful enough to rebuild everything that was lost. Omotola looked ahead, her steps steady, her heart quiet. Not because life had become perfect, but because she had found something stronger than survival. She had found purpose, and this time it would not be taken from her. Sometimes the world will test you in ways that feel unfair, even cruel. It will place you in moments where doing the right thing seems to cost more than you can afford, where kindness feels invisible, and where truth is ignored. But your choices still matter, not because people see them immediately, but because they shape who you become. Omotola's story reminds us that real strength is not found in power or wealth, but in character. It is found in the quiet decisions we make when no one is watching, in the courage to remain kind, when it would be easier to turn cold, and in the willingness to stand in truth even when it stands alone. And sometimes, just when it feels like everything is lost, life finds a way to return what you gave multiplied, transformed, and timed in a way you never expected. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there right now? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories of hope, justice, and transformation. Because stories like this are not just meant to be heard. They are meant to be lived.